Okay, so hello, my name is Diane Lalonde, and I am the Research and Knowledge Mobilization Specialist with the Learning Network. On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub teams, welcome to our webinar, The Incel Movement in Canada, Context and Practices of Intervention. I want to acknowledge our work is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Tongakan nations. These lands are connected with the London Township and Songbird Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We make this acknowledgement to counter the doctrine of discovery and recognize Indigenous land and sovereignty. We also recognize that many Black people were violently displaced to Canada through settler colonialism and slavery. We will continue to work collaboratively with communities to challenge colonialism, anti-Black racism, and further forms of oppression that remain pervasive in Canada and that result in disproportionate impacts of gender-based violence on oppressed communities. We also want to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the 6th anniversary of the Toronto van attack, which occurred on April 23rd, 2018, which harmed many and took the lives of the individuals that are shared on this slide. This act of violence committed by a self-declared incel points to the necessity of raising awareness about incel ideology and intervening to prevent incel violence. And so we're holding this webinar as an act of hope for change. And we do recognize the heaviness of this topic on this day. And so we will be sharing some supports and services in the chat. And if you need to take a step away from the webinar, please do so. We are recording it, we're sharing the slides. We'll make sure that you have access to it after as well. So today we are really honored to be joined by Esli and Ruxi. Esli is a PhD in political science at McGill, PhD student in political science at McGill University. Her research focuses on emerging online extremist groups, disinformation, and the recruitment of women into far-right movements. And Ruxi is a registered social worker and doctoral candidate at Carleton University's School of Social Work. Ruxi's research focuses on the incel community, including exit strategies within this community. We're going to begin first with a presentation by Esli, followed by a presentation by Ruxi before we move into the Q&A. So Esli, I'm going to pass it over to you to get us started. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I want to begin by thanking the Learning Network for having us today. And also I want to highlight the important work that they do related to gender-based violence and the many great events and resources that they have. And I encourage everyone to visit their website. And so the objective of this presentation today is to discuss the incel movement in Canada and its intersections with gendered violence and extremism. I'll be talking about the ideologies of the incel movement, how it's situated in the Canadian context, and how it particularly relates to gendered violence and also to extremism. I hope that my portion of the presentation today will set up as a backdrop to Ruxi's work, which will talk a bit more about therapeutic and clinical angles to incel exit. I also want to begin by providing a trigger warning that this presentation includes mentions of physical and sexual violence, and to encourage everyone to prioritize their own safety and security during this webinar. Before we get into it, I also want to acknowledge that I'm located in Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal, which is on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. And so McGill University, of which I attend, has also long served as a meeting place for Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McGill's namesake, James McGill, has also enslaved Black and Indigenous people. And so the money and labor he acquired through these acts are part of McGill's history and are part of our educational spaces today. And so I encourage everyone to learn about the lands that they are on at native-land.ca. To quickly introduce myself, my name is Esli, and I'm currently a PhD student at McGill University in the Department of Political Science. My research focuses on the intersection of technology, extremism, and gender issues. And so my presentation today is based largely on my work, which was published in 2022 in the journal Violence Against Women. And so just for a quick recap, This work evaluated an incel web forum, incels.co, and a case study of incel violence, which refers to the Alec Manassian van attack. And I compared these instances to risk assessment frameworks that are used in Canada to reveal how we understand incel and gender threat within our current frameworks. I'll begin with a quick overview of the history and development of the incel movement. I'll talk about how the incel movement has evolved in the online space and how it relates to gendered violence and extremism, and also draw a few implications, thinking about how we situate and understand the impact and threat of incel violence, how we can address incel violence and the key players that would be involved in this, and how we can also balance some ideas around sympathy towards individuals who may be in need of mental support, but also holding violent actors accountable. And so why are we talking about incels now? So incels, to begin with, are known often in the current contemporary debates as a misogynistic community largely comprised of men that blame their involuntary celibacy or lack of sexual experience on women. And so as a result, they spread harmful gendered language and promote violence against women because of this lack of sexual gratification. And so in recent years, we've seen a greater attention being paid towards the idea of incels. And perhaps we can associate this to a few things. First, the fact that there have been more physical acts of violence attributed publicly to incels, and we have seen this also increasingly publicized in the news. Thus, there's an increased awareness and public consciousness around this matter. This is also in hand with the fact that there is more fascination with the unique worldview and ideology of incels that aren't often known in mainstream media. As well, the reality is that there also has been greater polarization within the political sphere, and we have seen the rise of different fringe groups take forefront in different social media platforms. And this leads me to my point on social media and how this creates an online breeding ground for different groups, such as incels. However, it's important to note that incels are not a new phenomenon, but emerged in the 90s. Beyond that, male violence driven by patriarchal worldviews are common throughout our society and over time. They can manifest in different ways, leading to gendered harm. And so it's important to point out this because although we may understand incels to be a momentary hot topic, the idea of this ideological misogynistic violence is not new, and it continues to evolve into new forms of extremism and gendered violence past incels itself. And so we also see the growing influence and impact of these online communities and spaces, being a key location of political and social engagement that influences the everyday lives of individuals and can contribute to the iteration of future forms of violent misogynistic groups. But the main problem or issue I want to address today is how we seek to understand and frame incels within our different kind of spaces and working environments. We do see the acknowledgement and existence of incel violence, but through my studies, what I've found is that we often undercharacterize the persistence and systematic threat of gendered physical violence by these communities, and how we have historically minimized threat perceptions from gendered violence by law enforcement communities. I've also found that we often characterize these incel actors as lone wolf actors that work by themselves, without understanding the larger community behind them and the larger kind of connectedness that informs their radicalization. Further, when these actors act out physically, we often dismiss the importance and connectedness of the online network that underpins their radicalization. And more recently, there's greater discourse on how the ideas of mental health can be weaponized by these communities as a scapegoat for responsibility. So to provide some greater context, the incel community emerged around the 1990s, I believe in the 1997, established by a woman called Alana, who's actually based in Canada. And so she wanted to create an online social support group to allow individuals to talk about their dating experiences and gain dating advice. And this was a largely innocent place and a place for support. In the early 2000s, however, there was a separation of this incel community into two different forums. And so there was incel support, which was a lot closer to Alana's vision, where people would discuss their feelings of celibacy and were more supportive and inclusive. However, there was a separate group called Love Shy, which took on a character of what we know more today as incels, where people would blame women specifically for their lack of sex and allowed individuals to spread more misogynistic and violent rhetoric. And over time, Love Shy really took over as the dominant group and became more violent. I also want to situate the incel movement within the larger complex of the men's rights movement, who holds different ideologically misogynistic beliefs and manifests in different subgroups, of which incel is one of them. And so other subgroups in the men's rights movement include men's rights activists who conduct forms of social activism in response to the feminist movement. There's also pickup artists who try to follow certain scripts and strategies to get women to have sex with them, and later on will denigrate the women. And so I also want to highlight that tenets of the incel movement are also associated to other white supremacist groups that talk about the purity of race, of interbreeding with racialized women, and holding other far-right and ultra-conservative ideologies. And this also includes the fact that incels often talk about preferred facial and physical characteristics that lean towards affirming the supremacy of whiteness. And so as the incel movement has evolved, I want to point out some of the key ideological tenets and terminology that is central to the beliefs and provide some insight into the violence that occurs today. And so for their central ideology, as discussed and popularly known today, incels, or involuntary celibates, view their lack of sexual intimacy with women as a form of oppression and discrimination unfairly imposed on men. And this perceived systemic injustice is the core motivation for their actions and used to rationalize any negative experiences they may have had. And so as a result of this, they justify forms of retribution and violence against women, directing their frustrations through gendered harm and gendered violent speech. But within the incels and their understanding of gender ideology, we also see a hierarchy that incels describe amongst men. So at the top of the hierarchy are the ideas of chads. And so we see an imagery of a chad on the right-hand side of your screen. And so incels believe that 80% of women are only interested in these types of men. And chads are known to be alpha and dominant men who will get women known as Stacys. And so Stacys are used as a way to characterize the typical woman. And so they often characterize them as people who are only attracted to these alpha males and only attracted to the physical attributes of men. And so besides the 80%, we have the 20% left of women who are just attracted to what incels called normies or acceptable men. And so this leaves incels essentially out of this hierarchy of perception and favorability from women, and they see themselves as unwanted by women in this hierarchy. And so we can see that as the left-hand side of this image. And so while incels do vilify these chads or these other men, it's important to know that the dominant use of violent language is still targeted towards women. And so the theme of this ideology here is that violence always returns to targeting women, despite other men or chads getting in the way. And this is reaffirmed by the idea of talking about taking different pills, which sinks incels deeper into violent beliefs. And so being part of the incel community is also about taking different pills. So taking the red pill refers to revealing the truths about this incel hierarchy that women are only attracted to these chads. But further than that, incels talk about taking the black pill, which takes it a step further, where incels realize that they will never escape this nature as subordinate to these chads. It's also linked to this biologically deterministic nature, where incels take characteristics of height, weight, whiteness, and their jaw shape as what determines a chad or not. And we see some entry points here around debates about race and whiteness that are reinforced in incel beliefs. But black pilling is where it gets much more violent, where red pilled beliefs see that there may be a hope towards becoming a chad as an incel. Taking the black pill is much more fatalistic and doomist, where incels see that there's no way out and the only way forward is to find retribution against women. And so taking the black pill is both this allegiance to the community of incels and adopting a commitment to violent beliefs about women. And so part of this radicalization and reinforcement of the black pill ideology central to incel beliefs is the role of the online space. And so in my 2022 study, what I also found important was the fact that online communities and social forums reinforce almost every element of the radicalization process and reinforcing of incel beliefs. So these online spaces are often the only place where incels may feel safe to talk about their feelings. There's often a sense of shared loyalty and acceptance amongst incels that they can receive in these online forums as compared to everyday life. Further, their beliefs are often reinforced by one another, creating this echo chamber effect that reinforces the acceptability of violent ideas. Another thing I found in my study is that online networks also enable one another to gain resources. And so such as the van attack, this allows them to plan and gain access to different weapons, different tools for their attack, and gain affirmation that going through with a physical violent attack is the way to go. Furthermore, the use of language is very important in these groups, both to hide the intention of what they're doing, but also reinforce a sense of in-group acceptance and loyalty. And so incels will often create their own language, as we have seen with the ideas of the Black Pill, the Chads, or Stacys. And they'll include the use of sexually violent terms like pump and dump to create their own community language. And so once again, this reinforces a sense of belonging, but at the same time, this very specific terminology that's also sexually violent can be a barrier for outsiders to understand what they are really trying to say and their motives and intent. And so this is a way for incels to also minimize the perceptions of threat and violence. Incels are also very strategic online, jumping from platform to platform when they get shut down, and they've even established their own websites like incels.co. And so ultimately, this debunks the dominant idea that incels are lone wolf actors, both in the sense that these physical attacks by incels are often seen as one-off, but also that they act by themselves. It's increasingly important when we assess these physical acts of violence like the van attack to understand the online context and the online community that underpins these actors. And so with all of this backdrop, we can kind of see the different ways that incel communities are built up and their central ideological tenets. Now, I want to connect this to some of the implications of how this might impact Canada. First, by kind of highlighting two of the major events that have happened in Canada in recent years. So in 2018, known as the van attack, Alec Manassian drove a van down a busy road in Toronto and unfortunately murdered 10 people, 8 of which were women. Manassian also posted online about his alliance to the incel rebellion and also praised Elliot Rodger, a 2014 incel individual who had killed many people in Alta Vista as well. And this case is often seen as what really situated the incel debate in Canada. In 2020, we also see another incel attack that occurred in Toronto at a massage parlor. And so just recently, this was actually ruled as the first incel-related attack of terrorism in Canada. And so we can see that incel violence is very real in Canada, and there are increasing linkages between ideological extremism and the gender tenets of terrorism and of violence. And so through these case studies, I want to highlight some of the main things we should be thinking about. First, we need to continually refine how we understand gendered violence to implicate how misogyny evolves through the online space and its connections to extremism. And so, for example, Canada has established a strategy to prevent and address gender-based violence that does talk about online cyberstalking and cyber violence against women. But most of the strategy talks about the specific targeting and relationality towards women that occurs in the online space. This is in comparison to in-group radicalization, where there is no direct contact with women in the online space at the first hand, and the interaction with women actually occurs offline. And so while these strategies are important steps and milestones towards a comprehensive understanding of gender violence, it should also consider how the online space can be an environment for planning, for in-group rhetoric of misogyny and radicalization that leads to gender violence that occurs in the offline realm. And so what I'm advocating for here is for a more robust understanding of the online space when we assess gendered violence and how it is a place for strategizing amongst incels, where the violence against women may not occur in that moment online. There are also a lot of different definitions when it comes to online gender-based violence or online sexual violence. And so in my perspective, there's a need to expand definitions from just online gender-based violence to technology-facilitated gender-based violence. And a focus on technology understands the multiplicity of how technology can embolden different tools and techniques to influence gendered violence. Further, the term facilitation is important because it emphasizes how abusers and incels can organize, disguise, and manipulate the online sphere and technology to impact women's participation. So a focus on facilitation demonstrates the active role of technology in its role as impacting gendered violence. A focus on facilitation also connects how harm doesn't always just occur online, but can connect to offline realities. Furthermore, one of the ongoing debates is how we understand the limits of free speech and online hate speech. And so there's a need to establish and implicate dimensions of gendered hate language as distinct in the ways that we have talked about developing a more robust understanding of gendered harm. As speech can also travel and be dialogical through the online and offline sphere, and how it ultimately can lead to physical acts of violence. Further, another consideration we have to understand is the implications and connections of gender and misogyny to how we understand the frameworks of extremism. And so within the Canadian context, we've seen improvements in the way that incel movements have been understood in extremist frameworks. Firstly, we obviously see this in the terrorism ruling for the 2020 massage parlor case that occurred in late 2023. Furthermore, in the House of Commons study that I have for the quote on what ideologically motivated violent extremism here in the first point, IMVE, this report also includes an angle of looking at incel extremism as one of the aspects of increasing IMVE in Canada. And so inceldom increasingly meets these aspects of extremism by the fact that it holds these obscure ideologies and is a movement of cohesive individuals that perpetuate a harmful worldview and perpetuate violence. But one thing I continually advocate for, and I believe is a crucial element to my study and to the understanding of extremism, is the need to refine our existing risk assessment tools for extremism to ensure that we have a comprehensive understanding of gender. And so in my 2022 study, I conducted a content analysis of the Alec Manassian police transcript and the incels.co forum with a time period that encompassed the Manassian attack. And so ultimately, I wanted to see how incels online would understand and interpret and react to the Manassian van attack. And so I compared these findings of how incels discuss these things, whether it be the Manassian police transcript or the incel forum, with two risk assessment frameworks that are used in various law enforcement bodies, including used in Canada. And so what I found is that extremism risk assessment frameworks often minimize the complexities of how gendered threat can manifest. And so, for example, ideology as a category in these frameworks is still often associated to kind of traditional religious understandings of extremism and do not account for misogynistic ideology. There's often racialized prescriptions of the basis of extremism as well, and terrorism that are dominant within the interview transcript, and can also dismiss how gender can be a major motivation. When gender is invoked within my content analysis, I found that it's often linked to more gendered stereotypes around the relationship between men and women that don't fully involve the dynamic and complex nature of misogyny within the worldview of incels. And so while we rethink the ways that we can incorporate gender into extremist frameworks and understandings, I also want to highlight that there should be a practice of care of how we assess gender. And so when we consider gender in extremist discourse, we should also be careful of offering solutions that may lead to surveying or being hyper-vigilant of women and gender issues that can lead to the policing of gender and the invasion of privacy. And so here I'm particularly mindful of the intersection of gender and race, and to be careful of pursuing increasing securitization and monitoring of vulnerable gendered populations as a fulsome solution, drawing particularly on the ways that racialized Black and Indigenous women communities have often been subject to over-policing. And so as we conceptualize how to think about addressing incel violence, I want to point out a few aspects of caution that I believe Roxy will touch on as well. And so I'll be brief here. First is that there are studies that demonstrate how COVID-19 and greater isolation has led more individuals to move onto the online space and join communities such as the incel community, and how this isolation can compound negative feelings in the incel community that can lead to pathways of extremism and radicalization. However, there needs to be a great amount of care in using these ideas on mental health, and recently studies about autism, not to conflate autism with mental health, and as ways that can scapegoat accountability for the harms that incels cause. And so, for example, in the court case against Minassian, autism was attempted to be used as a way to minimize the harm he caused. But this leads to a very dangerous connection between autism and violent activities that both minimize the accountability and responsibility of the abuser, while painting a very harmful picture that autism is linked to violence. And so this can also be said about mental health issues, once again, not wanting to conflate mental health with autism, as these are very separate things. And so while we need to kind of think about how to support these individuals and support sympathy for individuals that really do suffer from mental health issues or feel isolation and need for online community, we also have to hold violent individuals accountable and not conflate their violent acts with the causation of autism or mental health. In addition to these dimensions, I also want to highlight the complexity and the tensions of how we manage the online space as it relates to incels. And first, I want to acknowledge that there really is no one-size-fits-all solution in balancing free speech and hate speech regulation in the online space. And this really requires collaboration with different government actors, social media platforms, and civil society to empower a very gendered perspective to ensuring safe online spaces. And that there are three other considerations that I also want to address here and reiterate in assessing these kind of online tensions as they evolve. First, it's understanding how the online space is increasingly intertwined with the physical space and how violence is increasingly fluid and interactive between these spaces. Second, how fluid online spaces create complexities, particularly around gendered violence, and how we can assess and support motivations against gendered violence in navigating how violence moves from online to offline spaces. And lastly, how how the online space changes dimensions of surveillance and privacy of women's issues. So where the solutions we seek to adopt should include a gendered perspective, we should also be careful that we don't simply place women and add and stir them into security frameworks that can lead to their over-surveillance. And so to begin my closing here, I just want to highlight a few key players that we should be engaging when we talk about incel violence, gendered violence, and extremism. And while I separate out these actors, I also want to highlight the importance that these stakeholders need to work together with one another to inform a more robust understanding of gendered violence and extremism. And so first, there's a need to engage with diverse Canadian policymakers, ranging from individuals working in public safety, telecoms regulators who work on establishing standards for social media platforms and free speech, and policymakers related to women and gender issues. And so for them, this includes expanding and creating a more robust understanding of how misogyny and gender violence evolve currently, particularly in the online environment. It also involves reevaluating the risk assessment frameworks that we currently have within law enforcement practices to ensure that we have a robust understanding of gender ideology. And it's also encouraging an interdisciplinary and collaborative perspective between these policymakers, especially focusing in on technologists, law enforcement, and gender professionals. We also need to look at this from an international level with how Canada is actively involved with the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and has also established a feminist foreign policy. And this includes acknowledging how gendered misogynistic actors, such as incels, are global actors and not confined to just one country. And so incels must thus be implicated within our work in the WPS agenda. This also includes taking a gendered approach to establishing cyber and technology norms in the United Nations forums and ensuring that we have a gendered approach to regulating the cyberspace. Other key players include social media platforms themselves, who evaluate how platforms are crucial in radicalization and in-group cohesion. And so this includes considering how content is monitored and if it's capturing these kind of misogynistic worldviews and discourse while balancing the ideas of free speech and over-surveillance. For educators, this means taking a preventative approach to all cyber and gendered violence. And this includes teaching children at a young age about safe practices in the online space, and also emboldening their parents and guardians with practical tools to engage with the online space with their children. As well, this includes advocating for early and expansive gender education that allows individuals to understand the real harms of gender violence. For health practitioners, which I'm sure Roxy will also talk about more, this includes a greater awareness of gender-based ideological and extremist indicators when working with clients. And so this includes working with academics, activists, and health practitioners together to really understand how incel ideology is grounded and evolves over time. I also want to make sure I revert back to evaluating the tensions of conflating mental health as a cause of incel violence and the need to hold individuals accountable in this process. Lastly, this also involves local communities, families, and friends, and is participating in webinars like this to really understand the realities and prevalence of misogyny and gendered violence online, and advocating for the awareness of gendered violence within our workplaces and within our local spaces. And I encourage individuals to really adopt a proper cyber hygiene and then advocate for robust gender education within their communities. And so thank you so much for your time. I'm always available by email if you have any questions, and I would like to pass the time to Roxy.
Thank you so much, Esley, and thank you all so much for being here and for having me speak on such an important topic. I am so appreciative of the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub for facilitating this webinar. And I thank Esley for starting us off so comprehensively by situating this incel phenomenon in a Canadian context, but also very much a global context as well. So as mentioned, my name is Roxy George, and I am coming to you from the unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabeg territory, aka Ottawa. So as we do this work, it is crucial for us to remember that modern day gender-based violence is inseparable from its history of colonialism. Now, a bit about myself. I wear a few different hats. So I am a doctoral candidate at Carleton University's School of Social Work in Ottawa. And interestingly, as we heard from Esley, Alana, the person who started the original Incel Forum back in the 90s, was actually from my school, from Carleton University. And so I really feel as if today I'm coming full circle by locating this work here, where the community began and unfortunately mutated into what it is today. My PhD research focuses on the intersection of toxic masculinity in direct therapeutic practice, and especially with regards to women identifying clinicians who are supporting incel clients, and especially how things like empathy works in that clinical space. Alongside my PhD, I'm also a registered social worker. So I provide clinical services and mental health counseling to the general population. But more recently, I have also started to focus providing therapeutic support to crime-involved, ideologically radicalized individuals here in Ottawa. It's not incels in particular, but I do work with many ideologically radicalized clients, and I see many similarities in this realm. So this means that I very much come to this webinar on incels informed not only by the research that I do, but also my direct experience in this realm as well. So my portion of the webinar is split into 3 main sections. We'll start off with therapeutic work with incel clients, move into exit, disengagement, and de-radicalization, and then we'll end with some takeaways and further readings. On this slide here, you'll see a list of incel demographics, general demographics. What I do want to highlight, though, is that we know incels are indeed sometimes physically violent, particularly against others, and this is in the form of violence against women, homicide, as we see in the news, but also they're sometimes physically violent against themselves as well in the form of self-harm or suicide attempts or completion. I also want to highlight, though, that most of them are not actively physically violent. With that being said, they do engage in everyday misogyny, which in itself is, of course, violent because it normalizes sexism. If we were to summarize their worldview, incels' entitlement is a symptom of broader patriarchal power. And so they scapegoat and blame women and feminism by association for their loneliness. Now, this loneliness is both perceived and sometimes real for various reasons, right? There are many reasons why people might stay single despite wanting otherwise. The difference, though, is that incels mobilize their loneliness as entitlement and anger against women. And of course, everyday misogyny in the incel community means that misogyny is routine. It's normalized, and in fact, it's expected in the incel community. So we'll move into the first part, therapeutic work with incel clients. So there are several studies on incels that have found that in comparison to the general population, incels have significantly higher rates of mental health challenges and disorders and diagnoses, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, histories of bullying and exclusion, which we know in itself is not a mental health challenge, but of course amplifies them, ASD as well. But as Lee mentioned, this does not mean that we should conflate mental health challenges with inceldom. I really want to highlight this. Plenty of people who have mental health challenges are not incels. So to say that mental health disorders or illnesses equals inceldom is incredibly stigmatizing. As a clinician, however, I do want to say that mental health challenges are still very much present in the incel community and amplify these issues nonetheless. Interestingly, over half of incels actually seek counseling and therapeutic services on their own. However, most of them stop attending because they either distrust therapy or they see it as unhelpful or a scam, a waste of money, or that it ultimately can't quote unquote fix their ugliness or their loneliness. And actually, more than half of incels who do attend therapy feel judged or that the professional they were working with blamed them for their inceldom without actually taking the time to understand their situations. In terms of therapeutic outcomes, one study by Moskalenko and colleagues found that while half of incels do go to therapy, about 47% of incels said that they experienced no change to their mental health. 15% said that they felt worse, and only 6% reported feeling better. So ultimately, many incels seek psychosocial services, but they don't like it. Only 6% or so feel better. So then what happens in this space? And what is our role as practitioners, as caseworkers, as clinicians? Imagine if you encountered a client that held super sexist views that sounded somewhat similar to incel ideology that we're learning about today. How might you respond? Would you call them out on their problematic views? Stick it out and explore their views to see where they're coming from? Leave? As you might imagine, there are some ethical and personal tensions that very well might come up for you. If we were to take a feminist perspective and apply it to therapy, to counseling, it would say that structural forces like the patriarchy, like gender roles, misogyny, and norms of masculinity, these things seep into clinical sessions because clinical sessions, according to feminist perspectives, are a microcosm of larger social conditions. This means that these structural notions of masculinity, of patriarchal norms, etc., these things can and do arise in therapy. Therapy with incels is just one example of this microcosm, of this macrocosm. Now, if I had a top list of recommendations for mental health professionals and caseworkers who are supporting incel clients or might support incel clients in the future, and recommendations that are based on what the literature says, or at least what the literature hypothesizes, it would be first and foremost to know what incel communities are, what they believe in, but also what they struggle with. It really does surprise me how often I talk to practitioners, caseworkers, clinicians who don't know what incels are, even though it's very likely that they might encounter an incel client in their practice sometime if they haven't already. The second recommendation I would suggest is to take care of yourself. Be aware of how you feel when working within this context. This means being aware of your own triggers and your own thresholds. Do this work if you are able, but don't do this work if you can't. And I know that sometimes we don't have much choice over the clients that we get. And in that case, awareness of your own stuff, your own triggers, your own thresholds is so key because it allows you to then work on emotionally regulating yourself enough to be able to support the client psychosocially and do your job. With that said, I also encourage you to talk to other people, seek supervision, and seek peer support, and remember why you're doing this work in the first place. Interestingly, the literature also advises for practitioners to resist acting on feelings of dislike or resist acting on feelings of needing to immediately debate their ideology. Doing so might actually result in cyclically arguing about ideology, which we know is not the purpose of psychosocial services like counseling. And in fact, it could run the risk of reinforcing the client's distrust, their anger, or even their ideology. Instead, scholars and practitioners suggest to start by first building rapport, a relationship with the client, by helping them get their basic needs met, as you would with any other client. There's no empirical research to date on what best therapeutic practices to use, but scholars have suggested MI, motivational interviewing, or CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, to help incel clients reframe some of their incel ideology and their worldview. But also person-centered therapy is always something that I see suggested in the literature, no matter whether you're working with incels or otherwise. Once that relationship, that rapport is built, then as a practitioner, you might want to start working to interrogate their ideology as a way to start trying to reframe how their thinking is flawed. It's important to explore what this ideology means to them and how it serves and benefits them, because it does serve and benefit them in many ways, but also how it harms them and how it harms the people around them. The literature also suggests that as practitioners, it's important to focus on building good coping skills and resiliency that is away from the incel community. And especially encouraging incel clients to focus on healthy self-improvement activities and encouraging healthy community connections that are away from the online incel forums or the discussion boards or the chat groups. This would help them garner feelings of acceptance and self-worth away from inceldom. It's also very key to situate men's histories and contexts into those overarching structures that we were discussing earlier, about how the patriarchy harms us all, and how masculinity and gender norms impact incels specifically and could cause gender-based violence. As you would with other clients, work to better understand the incel client and see them as multidimensional people, because there is a lot of variety within this community. And also because we know that so many men perpetrators of violence often do have histories of being abused and neglected themselves. And many times we know that hurt people hurt people. At the same time, use that information to understand why they are here and the harm that they are reproducing, while not reinforcing or validating their worldview. You can 100% be an understanding clinician while still holding people accountable to the harm that they have caused and are continuing to cause. And finally, what about empathy? When it comes to the empathy question, the literature is quite conflicted. Especially as caseworkers and practitioners, empathy is kind of like our professional compass, alongside things like non-judgment and meeting the client where they are at. But when it comes to working with clients who hold harmful ideologies, like incels, empathy becomes more of a murky concept. In clinical work, empathy is supposedly good and helpful, at least partially, because it helps you understand how somebody may have come to adopt this ideology. But too much empathy can cloud judgment, impede accountability, and in some cases, produce what scholar and author Kate Mann has called himpathy, which I'll speak to in a moment. So while empathy is considered fundamental to providing psychosocial services, it is also important to critique it within this context as well, especially when we think about who does empathy serve, who can it harm, and what ideologies might it reinforce. There have been quite a few critiques of empathy, but I did want to focus on Kate Mann's, her concept of himpathy. In her book, Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, Kate Mann coined the term himpathy to describe how excessive sympathy or empathy for men who perpetrate gender-based violence works to erase victimized women's experiences and not hold men accountable. So basically, himpathy causes us to victimize the oppressor while ignoring the actual people harmed, and empathizing with the side of the oppressor without challenging the harm that they have caused can merely run the risk of reinforcing the structural harm that they're simply emitting. For example, have I had sexist and racist clients? Yes, of course I have. And while I might work to understand why they got to where they're at, I certainly won't be validating those harmful views, because I know that doing so would reinforce the systems of harm that I am very much against. That said, empathy is not neutral. When we work with incel clients, there's a whole slew of fundamental power imbalances and dynamics present. But despite this, there still is a good place for mental health work to be done, but we have to be critical in this sphere. Now, engaging in professional therapeutic support with incels is just one of my research focuses and one avenue of countering inceldom. Another part of my research also looks at more informal and more non-professionalized ways that incels support each other to get away or get out of the community. Which brings us to part 2, exit, disengagement, and de-radicalization. There is so much research on how and why people become incels, the behaviors that they do, and the ideologies that they identify with. But there's only a handful of emerging research on exiting. So this section of the webinar will go over a small study that I conducted on a subreddit forum called r/incel-exit. r/incel-exit is an online community on the website Reddit that was created in 2019, made for current incels, but also seemingly made up of former incels as well, who are trying to help current incels leave. As the name suggests, incel-exit is about exiting inceldom for people who want to leave the community behind and distance themselves from that worldview. Incel-exit has about 18,000 registered members. And I want us to bookmark that number, 18,000 registered members. If we compare that to one of the largest websites that incels are on, which is www.incels.is, incels.is has about 25,000 registered members. So 25,000 members on the biggest incel website versus about 18,000 on incel-exit. This to me suggests that there's potentially quite a lot of interest in leaving, in exiting. So the purpose of this small study was to explore how online community support can be mobilized to encourage, share, teach, and sustain concrete exit strategies that can help incels move away from inceldom. So the study asked, what's being said on these forums, and what concrete behaviors and activities are being promoted to support exiting? I'm going to skip this theory slide and move right into data collection, where we essentially captured the top 25 most engaged discussion threads. So the discussion threads on incel-exit that had the most interaction, the most upvotes, and the most comments. And we analyzed them, and we found 5 key ways that support incels to exit the community. The biggest and first theme that we found was the focus of self-improvement and self-care. Here, the community members on incel-exit encouraged incels to take care of themselves and to work on themselves as a really important factor to their exiting journey. This looked like mental and physical health care, lifestyle changes, skill building, learning new hobbies. And these things were key because we know that incels do have mental health challenges. They are socially isolated, and they do often feel as if their life is going nowhere. So like this user quote here says, none of these changes flipped a light switch in my head and made me happy. It was too gradual for that. But once I started improving my life in small ways, it became easier to make more improvements. I think this is the Chinese finger trap aspect of the black pill. By not obsessing about sex and dating, and instead just focusing on making myself happier in ways that I could control, I was unintentionally turning into a more attractive person. The second biggest theme that we found was community involvement. We know that most incels have a very limited social circle offline, and so they turn to the incel community online to fill that social gap. So as practitioners and as caseworkers, we cannot just expect incel clients to leave the incel community cold turkey without having any other communities to fall back on. So members on incel-exit encouraged incels to build community outside and away from incel spaces. They encouraged community engagement, making new friends, attending events, joining local clubs, and so forth. So this user here, quote, says, I decided I wanted to make some friends. I would never find a girlfriend, but I might as well have some friends to talk to. So I started signing up for random meetups. Eventually, I made some friends. This wasn't love or sex, but it felt like people enjoyed talking to me, like I had some basic worth as a human being. Maybe I'm a virgin loser, but not an absolutely worthless virgin. The third theme that we found was the importance of disrupting incel rhetoric. So community members knew that it was important for incels to distance themselves not only from the incel community, but also from the incel ideology. And that is very hard to do when you so deeply believe that this is the truth. So community members on Incel Exit had engaged in a lot of almost dialectical exchange conversations to challenge and question incels' current misogynistic beliefs. And they did this by finding exceptions, deconstructing generalizations, introducing alternative perspectives, and adding nuances to Black and white thinking. So this first quote here says, a lot of the Black pill mindset is based on these cognitive distortions. To think that being unable to find a partner means that life isn't worth living, that's catastrophizing. So you see here, this user is showing how the Black-pilled fatalistic incel mindset is actually a flawed thinking pattern. Fourth, we found that exiting was very nonlinear. To exit is a process of negotiation where there is no clear recipe for exiting because there are a lot of unique push and pull factors that both pull incels away from the community while also drawing them back in. We found a lot of negative emotions associated with leaving, like depression, anxiety, or loneliness, that would pull them back into the incel community, but then also a sense of hope for something different or maybe even something better that might pull them out and away from the incel community. We also found, though, that many incels trying to leave were still navigating their own sexism. So in this quote here in the blue box, this user says, being able to be friends with women without immediately expecting a relationship is pretty much the antidote to incel misogynistic thinking. You find out femoids are actually much more complex and interesting than the prospect of having sex, smiley face. And no, you're not a cuck for befriending women. It's actually a very refreshing experience. So you see how incels, despite trying to leave, they're kind of in this in-between space where they're not 100% exited, but they're also not 100% incel either. Almost as if they have 1 foot in and 1 foot out of inceldom. The last theme that we found was that community encouragement sustains this process of exiting. Here, users in Incel Exit were a source of motivation, of hope, of empathy sometimes, where users were met with support, patience, and non-judgment no matter what was said. So you see in this first quote, a user is saying, nice job getting off the internet and away from toxic spaces. Keep it up. And the user in the bottom quote says, I think I'm really going to put serious mental and spiritual energy into letting go of this hate, preconceptions, and expectations that have stunted me for so long. I want to thank the people here that have gone really deep with their comments and advice in aid of complete and total strangers on the internet. I will end with one more user quote who says, what de-radicalizes people is not facts, but emotions, community, acceptance, and a sense of belonging. I find that a lot of the response to incels have been criminal justice interventions, which don't actually address the root of the problem or help them move away from the harmful ideology. In fact, it might push them further down the rabbit hole. What we found was that there was no clear A plus B equals C linear recipe for exiting, and that a lot of people on these forums still had a lot of sexism that they were navigating. But what was common throughout was that they kept trying because of this community support, encouragement, and non-judgment. So it's worth considering the productive potential of both formal psychosocial services like mental health, like counseling, but also more informal self-help communities like this one. When we work to develop programming that targets incels or adjacent communities. Okay, the takeaways and the further reading. Before getting into the further reading, I really want to be clear that mental health illness, mental health challenges is no excuse for misogyny and entitlement over other people. The root cause of a gender-based violence problem is misogyny and the patriarchy. So to assume that the problem is mental health is to ignore the bigger structural problems. Mental health is, however, very, very often a contributing factor. In my perspective and experience, incels' grievances are not caused by mental health challenges, but they are amplified and worsened by these challenges. Now, there are a whole bunch of efforts that are being worked on to address incels, and mental health is just one of these efforts. We certainly need to do something about this, and this is one place to do it, but the work may begin with mental health, but it definitely does not end there. So I wanted to end by providing a little shameless self-promo that I have published 3 papers on incels so far. The first one is on the intersection of race and incels. It is open access, so you can read it if you're interested. The second one takes a critical look at the intersection of incels, autism, and ableism. And as Lee mentioned, this is quite relevant because we know the Toronto van attacker unsuccessfully tried to use his autism as a defense behind his van attack and subsequent murder of 11 people. And again, although incels typically experience worsened mental health issues across the board, it is usually autism that is focused on, and that is incredibly stigmatizing and problematic. This article is not open access, but please, I'm happy to email it to you if you reach out to me. And finally, the third article is on incel exit, which I presented the findings of today. Again, this article is not open access, but I am happy to send it to you if you reach out. Final resources that I'd like to post. The first one is a report by the Organization for the Prevention of Violence coming from Alberta. It is a backgrounder for practitioners working with incels specifically. The second one is a very well done and comprehensive report by Moonshot on understanding incel violence in Canada. And the third is a link to a website called CPN Prev, or the Canadian Practitioners Network for the Prevention of Radicalization and Extremist Violence. It's essentially a network of practitioners in Canada who work in countering violent extremism and radicalization. So if you're a practitioner working in this sphere, it can be lonely. And so this is an excellent resource that I am a part of and definitely would recommend as well. And I am all done. Thank you all so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your presentations, Esli and Ruxi. I'll invite Esli and my colleague Jessica to join us now, and I think we can stop sharing the slides as well. So we have the opportunity now to answer the questions that participants have been posing. And just so you know, Ruxi and Esli, they've been sharing how informative your presentations were and actually how they inspire hope, which is something nice for us to walk away from with today. If you haven't had a chance to pose a question yet, you can still feel free to do so in the Q&A box. And to facilitate this session, I'm really happy to be joined by Jessica Webb, who is the implementation coordinator with the Knowledge Hub. And I'm going to start with a question to you, Esli. So someone said, I'm interested in histories of patriarchal groups that engaged in practices akin to what we see now in the current incel community. I know that the violence isn't new, but I'm curious about the organized group nature that we see now. Have there been previous organized groups centered on gendered supremacy?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Um, I'm not sure if we will be sharing these slides, but within one of the citations that I had, I think Diane is nodding yes. Lilly 2016, I believe, or 2006, I can't remember off the top of my head, is a really great reading and resource about kind of a bit more of the contemporary developments of different men's rights groups. And she really, they really outline well kind of how it's evolved, including the incel groups. And I think your question about kind of the prevalence of like men's rights communities over time, I think that really is part of the conversation about incels and their kind of deeper influence of misogyny. And I think we do see this dating back to many years ago, even without the online space. We see like men's rights activists who have like fought against feminist movements and the feminist right to vote. And so I think it's really about this idea that like men's rights beliefs and this misogynistic beliefs will change with the social political context of the day and also the cultures of whatever country you're in. And I think they just manifest in different ways. And the incel group is just one of those iterations of this like long development of misogyny throughout society. And so I think this kind of like online angle and these like access to resources is compounding the more like violent nature of this iteration of like misogynistic groups. But I think it really is deeply rooted in how society has thought about feminism, how society has kind of developed these patriarchal beliefs from a long time ago.
That's great. Thank you. And it definitely relates to, as you talked about, the intersections with technology facilitated violence that we're seeing and some of the ways to respond to that. I'm going to pass it over to Jessica.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both so much. It was such a pleasure working with you and such a fabulous presentation. So, Rooksy, this is for you. Can you suggest any non-clinical resources that could support folks working with post-secondary students or younger people, younger men, that kind of came up a few times, who are ideologically radicalized or are at risk of radicalization? This person works with a lot of students who are entrenched in incel or incel adjacent culture or ideology, but lacks the capability to mandate counseling or clinical intervention.
Thank you. There are a couple organizations working in this sphere, and a lot of them focus on things like how to have discussions within the classroom with students who are holding these ideologies. I know that many teachers have said that they have heard the name Andrew Tate in their classrooms so often, and they don't know how to have those discussions, and it impacts their classroom, especially the young girls in that classroom. There are a couple of organizations working in this sphere, but off the top of my head, Civics comes to mind. I believe it's spelled CIVIX. But I can also come up with a list as well and share it with Diane and Jessica after the fact, which then might hopefully be posted for educators and others.
Great, thank you.
Perhaps I can add on here if that's possible. I know the Canadian Anti-Hate Network also developed, I think in the past year or two, a specific education program that supports teachers in talking about like hate speech and hate communities. So it's not specifically incels, but it kind of involves those kind of conversations. And so I believe they have like a specific tool for teachers. I've talked to them, and they've also, I think, worked with communities and like vulnerable women who are susceptible to like trad wives communities. And so they do kind of have this tenet of like gender ideology within their education programs. So that's another good resource for teachers too.
Excellent.
And anything you share with us, Rooksy and Esli, we'll add it along with the related resources for the webinar, because I know everyone's very interested in the resources, which is wonderful. So I have a question now for Esli, although Rooksy, you're welcome to respond as well. So someone was wondering, what do we know about how frequently the violence carries over out of the online environment? And what do we know about the degree to which incels are committed to incel ideology if they're not online or engaging with online incel communities?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's often, I think Rixie talked about it as well, not all incels are inherently violent or are trying to commit violence, though there is that connection. And I think we often see what's reported as those two like big scenarios that happened in Canada. And I think we often see like, oh, those are only the two examples out of perhaps a very large incel community, and therefore maybe incel violence isn't that bad. But I think and I definitely don't have the statistics for this, but I think this often impacts more of the immediate like family and friends of the incel community, whether that be their interactions with different women in their day-to-day lives and their workplaces. And so there can be interactions of violence there that are inspired by these incel ideologies and that are not necessarily accounted for in the media or accounted for in other surveys necessarily that don't have this kind of incel perspective. And so I think it's quite difficult to have kind of like a definitive answer for that. But I see that as something kind of that seeping into kind of like the beliefs systems of different men, perhaps, and that contributing to perhaps like more misogynistic ways of describing and like interacting with women in their day-to-day lives. And what was the second question that was part of that again, Diane?
So the second question was, what do we know about the degree to which incels are committed to incel ideology if they're not in the online environment?
Yeah, I think specific to incels, it really is an online experience. I think just because it has stemmed from this like online community in the like 1997 and how it's like evolved through these different iterations, and largely because the ideas of inceldom connect well with individuals because they feel like they don't have any other often like physical support or like friends in real life that can talk through them with these ideas. And so I think the online nature is really crucial there. But I also wouldn't be surprised if that's something that, especially perhaps with youth, that they bring these ideas offline and they bring it into schools and talk about their friends. And so that really reiterates that online to offline connection where a lot of the radicalization might occur online, but then it really makes its way into kind of these like school environments and everyday communities.
Thank you. I really appreciate you highlighting it's those everyday ways we don't always capture. Like it might be your employer, your teacher, your friend, and we're not capturing all those types of ways it's occurring. So I'll pass it to Jessica.
Great. So this is for either of you. Someone would like to know if there is a particular group or groups of men that gravitate to incel ideology, or does the ideology cut across age, race, religion, ethnicity, etc.?
That's a really interesting question. I think the studies that have been done that look at the demographics of incels show that incels are predominantly in North America. They're predominantly early 20s. About half of them are white, and surprisingly, half of them are racialized. That's surprising. But as Esli mentioned, this is largely an online thing. So folks that do have access to online, folks that game as well. What would you say, Esli?
I think it is exactly what you said. Like it is still very much more of like a North American idea, but I know that there's like tenets of communities that pop up more recently in Asia as well. I believe in Japan might have been one of them, but I don't remember the exact article that I read that from. But I think what you're saying is right, like early 20s, both kind of like white and racialized communities.
So next question, they were wondering about if you've explored, both of you, Ruxi and Esli, in your work, the femcel movement and what's occurring in there.
It's a very interesting community, both femcel communities and also WGTOW, women going their own way. I don't know if anybody has ever lurked in these communities online before, but in these communities, what I typically see from just doing a general scroll is that women are pretty fed up with the dating context in which they reside in. However, they do not translate that feeling into hatred of men. and they don't translate that into actively encouraging violence against men either. It looks more like I'm gonna just stay in my lane, be single, and do my own thing. Whereas in comparison, men incels have that anger vibe, they have that blaming vibe, and they scapegoat women and feminism directly.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it as much, but I think there's also kind of like an in-group tension of like if femcells can even exist. So I think a lot of the core ideas around incels is that like women are the ones who can choose like their partners or not. And so femcells can't really be a thing because women can just go and have sex with whoever they choose. And so they kind of disregards like women's perhaps like experiences with like poor dating environments or experiences. And so there's like that internal debate. I'm my kind of future dissertation work for my doctoral work actually looks at these ideas of like women being radicalized in these communities. And I think one way that Lixie also kind of positioned it is the very like kind of fraught positioning of women in these communities, particularly how they can be both perpetuators of harm and also victims of harm. And so they're like, obviously they advance this kind of pejorative ideology, but also perhaps like incels that are men also can act kind of violently towards femcells. And so there's this very, I guess, strange tension with the femcel community.
Yes, thank you.
So interesting. Can either of you speak to how incels view the LGBTQIA plus community? Is their violence also directed at these groups?
I can touch a little bit on it. I'm not as kind of versed in this literature, but I know there's the idea, I believe, and Roxy, maybe you can add on if you know more than me, the idea of like trans maxing to like overcome inceldom. And so incels talk about like being becoming a trans woman to overcome these feelings of like not being able to have sexual experiences, but I'm sure there's also kind of like hatred towards this community for their beliefs, but I'm not as well versed in that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I've seen that as well. And I think in general, because the incel worldview is so rooted in black and white views of gender, like there's only women, there's only men. So based on this, women are the selectors of partners. It leaves very little room for folks that are not a part of that binary. So when discussions do come up about anything LGBTQ, anything queerness, it's often dismissed or made fun of.
Okay, sorry, there's so many questions coming in. We're like, so the next question is for you, Ruxi. So someone's wondering, they mentioned they're working in frontline capacity, and they're wondering if you have any safety tips, both for participants and also for staff who might be faced with incel behavior and or rhetoric.
Yeah, that is such an excellent question. I think the first thing that I would say is don't do this work alone. If you have a team, please take advantage of that. And if you don't, make a team of other fellow clinicians that you know so that you can debrief about these things. Again, it's so hard to do this work alone. It's isolating, it's scary, it is taxing. I also recommend CPN Prev, which was one of the websites that I listed for clinicians that are working in this sphere, because they do have quite a few resources, and it is a network of practitioners who do work in this sphere directly. There's not many across Canada. There's about 40 practitioners who do this work, but it's there and it's strong. So community is one of the best safety hygienes that I would recommend.
Thank you. And I'm wondering as well, Esli, as a researcher, are there any safety tips that you've had for yourself in terms of kind of like navigating these forums, maybe, by yourself having to read all this content?
Yeah, I think it's quite similar to what Rixie's also saying, is to really prioritize your mental health, and also just to remove yourself from positions as a researcher sometimes, and letting yourself like walk away from the computer and disengage with perhaps like opportunities that you feel like you have a gut reaction that something might not go well. And so it's really trusting your gut with that, finding community, making sure you have support within your academic community, but also outside of your academic community, to really situate yourself in and out of your work. And I think there's also a lot of different kind of cyber hygiene practices. I think obviously there's one that we're doing today, like a webinar style, can really help kind of mediate different conversations in a way that's still fruitful, but also protecting different researchers. There's other ways to just kind of like limit your presence online that can really kind of protect yourself, but also still being able to do your research.
Great, thank you.
That's great. In reading your slides and preparing for the webinar, I have so much respect for the work that you both do and the heaviness of it. So thank you. This is for either. Could you please share more about any of the intersections you see between the incel movement and right-wing movements? Do you think the rise of right-wing movements also lead to a rise in the incel movement as well?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a big connection there. I think there's tenets of the right-wing movement that we see increasingly being present and accepted within kind of social discourse nowadays, especially around these ideas of gender education and gender fluidity. We see like backlash against that within different school boards. And I think that's really connected to this kind of gender frustration that does lead individuals towards inceldom. And so there's a greater acceptance of kind of pushback around gender progressivism, which I think there definitely is a link to kind of incel groups. And also I've kind of mentioned within the presentation as well, there's parts of incel ideology around beliefs of like appearing white, having white facial features and characteristics that kind of reinforce this idea of like a white racial hierarchy once again. And so we see that kind of also as like a central tenet of inceldom to begin with.
Exactly. And just to echo you, Esli, because the incel worldview is so focused on and angry about the rise in women's sexual freedom and liberation, that goes hand in hand with right-wing extremism and the rise of right-wing thought in general. For me, like I see them as one and the same almost.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next presenter is identifying that, and both of you mentioned this as well, that elements of incel ideology aren't limited to incel forms, but we see it play out in media, in politics, in our everyday lives. And so they're wondering, given that it's so entrenched in so many different areas, do you have any tips, maybe even how we could start to fight against this, or anything you think would be useful to change some of that dialogue?
It's so true that we're seeing as media progresses, as social media platforms change, we do see almost an entrenchment of incel worldview within our mainstream lingo. Like I've seen people talk about looks maxing, which typically was an incel specific term and now is being used by the general population. Or I've seen black pill as a common term now that is not used by only incels. And I see this always online on social media platforms, particularly TikTok. So I think, at least in the world according to Rooksy, I think there's a lot to say about online content moderation. I think that's where, for me, the focus should be for that.
Great. This is a great segue. Our next question was literally, what responsibility do you feel social media and online platforms have in addressing this issue and like, or gender-based violence from incels or otherwise?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here. Yeah, I think there's definitely a big role there, but I think it's a slew of a lot of other issues that these platforms are kind of dealing with. I think we can think about it in the context of like election interference, other right-wing groups that are organizing through like Facebook, for example. And so definitely there is a requirement, I hope, or kind of a interest in these platforms to moderate these communities. But I think at the end of the day, these platforms are also companies that want to make money, and this might not be the best in their best interest to kind of moderate and limit their engagement online. And so I think there really is a role of government here to be the ones to kind of regulate and establish like standards of kind of like platform engagement and how these like how content moderation can happen. And so I think it really is a collaboration between both like social media platforms and governments, but also these social media platforms really taking these issues seriously, which I'm not sure if they always kind of are when they talk about them.
See, I see you nodding. I just don't, if you wanted to add something, I want to create a space for it. But if not, I'm going to move into closing the webinar.
Exactly what Esley said. It is a collaborative. Totally. Thank you.
Okay, so that is all the time that we have today. Thank you so much to our presenters, Esley and Ruxi. This was a topic that a lot of folks in our audience have said they're interested in and want to learn more about. And so we're so appreciative to bring your research to our audience. I want to thank as well our ASL interpreters, Alex and Jennifer, and our French language interpreters, Sylvie and Wendy. And also a thank you to the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub broader teams. You would have seen Jasmine and Sabri in the chat. Jade is running tech, and Lee is doing slides, and Margarita's supporting Jessica and I with questions. So it's definitely a collaborative effort in running these types of webinars. And for participants, just to remind you, after the webinar closes, automatically in your browser, what will open is a optional feedback survey, and then you'll be taken to a separate form where you can get your certificate of participation. And otherwise, we look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar. Thank you so much.